morphed into evolving creatures in the element of earth. Earth, some way, captures the life of heaven, as in a vessel. And so it was represented in ancient times. It is the cup, or the container, the crater, which receives into itself the power of heaven. It had occurred to the Chinese, who were rather wise in many things, that if heaven had not produced earth, man could not have existed. And if man had not existed, there would be nothing to honor heaven. Now this is a kind of a cute thought, because it seems to tell us the main point. Namely, that it is through embodiment, individualization, and personalization that a kind of consciousness is created in man, which achieves self-awareness and ultimately space, time, consciousness, spirit awareness. Heaven, actually, as far as our thinking is concerned, could not exist without us. Without us, heaven would simply be this vast expanse of eternal processes. But man takes hold of this concept and dramatizes it. He romanticizes it. And not only that, but he begins to create this web of analogies to bind himself to this thing. It is man who has made heaven instructive. It is man that has caused the great philosophies of space to come into existence. Perhaps on another planet, something else beside man is doing the same thing. But for us, all of our very questing after reality is the result of the union in us of heaven and earth. The result of the mingling or marriage of the sun and moon, as the alchemists call it. The moon being the ancient, mad mother of the earth. And as the sun represents the great light, and the moon the reflected light, we find in man the sun represents spirit, the body itself, the earth, represents body, and the moon represents soul. And the ancient soul represented the psyche. And, of course, we all know that when the soul gets sick, we call it lunacy. We're deriving it from the sickness of the moon, or the sickness of the soul. In the development, therefore, of man, we can go back to the Chinese concept of ancestor worship. In China, the primordial ancestor of all that exists is heaven. All things exist only as the children of heaven. Shanti, imperial heaven, is therefore the complete, eternal, and inevitable sovereign. All China, which is the Middle Empire, which means the place of the reasonable, is descended from imperial heaven. Every living thing just traces, therefore, its ancestry to heaven in China, just as surely as in the Western thinking we're inclined to trace our family tree back to Adam and Eve. We trace ours back to the earth. They trace theirs back to the sky. Shanti, imperial heaven, was the absolute article. No one knows how heaven came into being. No one can estimate how long the reign of heaven will continue. Creations disappear periodically, but they simply go to sleep in the eternal power. And when worlds come into manifestation again, these worlds in the course of time once more recognize heaven. For of all things, heaven alone is worthy of absolute veneration. The Chinese say that it is worthy of eternal veneration because locked in it, in some mysterious way, is the answer to the one question. The question which has been asked since the dawn of time: what is truth? Truth is locked in the soul of heaven. Little fragments of it appear in the manifestation of deity, in all the processes of creation. But the total truth belongs to heaven alone. And heaven sits enthroned upon the phoenix throne, and before his eyes are the fringes of his bonnet. And these fringes are like the veils before the face of God, which no man hath lifted. The truth is forever veiled. And the veil is the sky, the mysterious blue drapery of the temple of Isis at Sais, the veil that no mortal will ever open. So that Shanti is the ancestor. All of the mortal emperors, beginning with Fuhi, are descended from imperial heaven. Imperial heaven sent its son to become its regent over men in the Chinese concept. And we have the same essentially in our own religious thinking. And this son of heaven was the first emperor and the beginning of the imperial line. And in China, all of the emperors were the agents of heaven. They were accountable to heaven. And the Chinese empire was a microcosm, or a miniature of heaven. And just as the universe was fashioned from the mingling of 5 elements, so surely China was an empire of 5 provinces. Every element that was present in the universal procedure was captured in the microcosm of the Middle Kingdom. Around the world of China was drawn the line which was the circumference of existence. China recognized no land outside of its own. But within its own area, it was like an alchemical bottle, within which were all the elements and materials of the cosmic processes. China believed this, and believed that it was truly the symbol of heaven. The primary formation of this symbol was therefore the establishment of the man-likeness of heaven. And of course, the primordial man-likeness was the emperor. And the emperor was the celestial Adam. The emperor was the archetype, the anthropos, or the overman, from whom all other forms of mortals were derived. The emperor was the patriarch, the founder of the line, the first of all ancestors on earth, and himself the Son of Heaven. And on the earth, therefore, men became, in a sense, all participants in the power of the emperor. All men have the same appearance of body and member, having 5 extremities, like the 5 provinces of China. Consequently, the human being became another type of microcosm, the little empire. And in man, all of the processes by which heaven sustained earth were reproduced in miniature. To study China was to study man. To study man was to study China. And all of their arts and sciences were built upon this interrelationship. Confucius made a great deal of the magic interplay of heaven and earth. Heaven, the forever bestowing. Earth, the forever receiving. Man, by his very nature, became the ever receiving, because with all other creatures he was sustained by the ever bestowing. Being that which must forever receive into itself, man had the possibility of a variety of receptivities. It was not simply necessary for him to inhale and receive the life of the air, or stand out in the sun and receive the light of heaven on the crown of his head. There was more to it than this. Man had to perfect his own receptivity. This is something we do not understand at all in the West, because we have tried so hard to play heaven that we have forgotten that it is necessary for us to be earth. This does not mean that there is no heaven in us, for it is the heaven in us that permits us to play earth. But man, by his very nature, is not and cannot be complete. Man is a spark. Heaven is the flame from which all the sparks came. Man is a part. Heaven is all. The part can never conquer all. But by the very nature of this relationship, the part can never be divided from the all, except by an act of itself, self-division, self-isolation. Confucius then explained that a series of proprieties had to be set up between heaven and earth. And Confucius took the attitude that earth itself was the perfect model of deportment. In other words, all the deportment of men toward heaven was derived from man's investigation, contemplation, and interpretation of the processes of earth. By this, of course, the ancient Chinese used a term for which we now use the word nature. In other words, nature was the handmaiden of heaven. Nature was the perfect responding agent. When the sun shone upon the earth, nature rose to meet the sun. Nature reacted instantly to every mood of heaven, whether it be the motions of stars and their calculations in nativities, or the various cosmic energies thrilling through space. According to the Chinese, the moment heaven struck the great gong, heaven having struck, earth echoed the tone. There was never a break. There was never an inconsistency. There was never any resistance or rebellion by earth. Earth simply responded. Earth, as the great mother, was the eternal consort of heaven as the eternal parent. So the union of heaven and earth has always been fruitful, even as the union of spirit and body has always been fruitful. The union of spirit and body produced mind. The union of heaven and earth produced man. Man was the creature, therefore, capable of having within his own nature the unfoldment of the principle of mind. And the great opposite, the great polarity, was finally reconciled in the nature and structure of man himself. Man had a peculiar and unique place in all this, according to Mencius. Man did not know all of heaven, but he sensed within himself something of the life of heaven. Man did not know all of earth, but he lived upon earth, and earth was in his very flesh. Consequently, man, in a strange way, knew something of heaven and earth. He knew something of the life within him and the body around him. He knew something or intuited something of the laws of heaven, and he experienced the strange patterns of the seasons and processes of earth. He was the child of these polarities. And in man, according to the Chinese, these great polarities were reconciled. It was man himself who created with his thinking the polarities. And it was man himself who had to reconcile by better thinking the polarities which he had created. For in the vast processes of universal existence, if man did not exist, time, space, world, heaven, earth, in their own natures would go on just the same. But man created them by interpretation. And the interpretations which he gave them set up psychic processes within himself. And as man cannot fulfill his own destiny, torn between two allegiances, as Goethe so well points out, that there are two souls within our breasts. One to heaven aspires, and the other in the earth suspires. There is always this struggle in us. The struggle toward inertia, which is earth, the struggle toward action or activity, which is heaven. One day inertia wins, another day activity wins. At the present process of living, inertia wins during working hours and activity when we're enjoying ourselves. But in any event, this struggle goes on. A man has to reconcile this struggle in himself. He has to realize, therefore, that there is actually no struggle except his own attitude about it. There has never been a war between heaven and earth, actually. There cannot be. Because heaven and earth are merely the expressions of one power in its infinite manifestation. There has never been a moment when earth rebelled against heaven. Rebellion arises not in earth, but in mind. Consequently, man having created within his own nature, by the processes of his own evolving being, the power to think, which is a power bestowed by heaven, but a power also invested in earth, a power in which the earth factor comes to immediate attention. Confucius points out that man, by his sight processes, has two forms of vision. One form of vision is to see the things of the world, the earth, the kingdoms of earth. And in seeing these, they are very real and immediate to him. He has another internal kind of vision for the contemplation of heaven. This vision is a sort of meditation process. But what man experiences in this meditation is like a dream. It is something he senses, but it has no tangibilities. Therefore, in his experience with his present sensory balance, as Buddha tells us, he has inevitably given more sense of reality to earth than he has to heaven. He has found the Great Mother more sympathetic than the Eternal Father. He has learned also that by some strange process, he seems to be able to conquer the earth, but he cannot conquer heaven. The earth becomes an instrument for the immediate fulfillment of desires, and heaven the object of an ultimate desire, which man does not understand. In the course of time, materialism thus came into existence, due to the proximity of material things and the remoteness of spiritual things. This was again part of the symbolism of the sun and moon, in which the moon appears to be nearer, appears to be brighter at night at least because it is nearer, but is only shining with the reflected light of the sun, but this we do not realize. Materiality, consequently, is man accepting the visible part of heaven and rejecting the invisible part. Perhaps not really entirely rejecting it, but utterly confused by it. It is very hard for a person to value something that he cannot see as much as he values something that he can see. It is hard for him to believe that wisdom, which he can hardly calculate, is more advantageous than a good bank account which he can examine every day. Thus, through his sensory perceptions, through his attachment, his desires, his thoughts, his ambitions, he has become more and more bound to earth. And what we call a materialist is simply a person who has found earth easier to understand than heaven, and finds the search for heaven more arduous than seems to be practical. We are in the world aware that certain processes will produce immediate results. When we turn to heaven, we are not so sure. And we have observed too long and too often the misfortunes of righteous men. This means, then, that we have gradually substituted the reflection for the reality. We have accepted earth as something real and heaven as something unreal. Now, the only difficulty with this new acceptance pattern is that it does not operate. As soon as we become earth-bound, and a soul which is focused upon earth is earth-bound, whether alive or dead. Once we have become earth-bound, we begin to sense another point that is interesting. The Chinese were well aware of this, namely that concentrating our attention upon the earth, we make a discovery. In terms of potential, man is greater than earth. Thus man can conquer earth. Man can have dominion over earth because earth cannot really fight back. Earth is receptive because it is its rule and its law, and it's inevitable to be receptive. Therefore, it must also be receptive of the tyrannies of men. Man discovering that he can mold earth into almost any pattern that he desires, and without any real insight into the rules governing life, the rules of heaven, inevitably gets himself into complex situations, following only his own judgment, which is a confusion of heaven and earth, ill-digested within himself. He permits ambition, desires, attitudes, and appetites to control his conduct in relation to earth or to nature. He tries in every way that he can to create in nature the fulfillment of his own desire. This seems to him the only thing that he can do. It does not seem very reasonable for him to attempt to build a corporation in space. But he can get some choice land here and go to work. Man, therefore, having made his own decision and choosing to cast his lot with the earth rather than with heaven, by so doing must take on the other negative aspects of earth. He must take on one of the inevitable facts of earth, namely constant mutation. The earth is completely impermanent. It is impermanent not only in the long-range sense, but it is impermanent like the body of man is impermanent. We think of man living 70, 80, 90 years. Actually, there is not a cell in man's body that lives a tenth of that time. Actually, every day we are in a case or state of mutation. Every day the inner structure of ourselves is changing, and our own death rate is greater than that of the human population of the earth. Everything is impermanent. The very processes of earth have their exhaustions. The wealth of the earth has its exhaustion. We are now worried about population explosion because earth is limited. And we're beginning to think more and more of how we are going to meet the demands of more place in space. The only thing we can think of is to try to mine space for food, to discover, if we can, the vitalities and energies in the air around us, and perhaps chain them to the perpetuation of our physical kind. The only other possibility is to reach out in space for another place, and another planet, hoping to find it either unpopulated or unable to defend itself. Then we will find a new opportunity, new frontiers, as we did 100 years ago within the area of our own earth. But earth has its limitations. Man has his limitations. And all these great plans and counterplots that men create all tumble down to nothing. And that to sit on it is the symbol of the ultimate fulfillment of life is a mistake. Because if you do not get off of the cushion, the next man who wants it will have you carried away. You will not remain too long. The Chinese and the Hindus also decided that there was only one way of measuring value in space, and that value has something to do with permanence. Now, permanence in philosophy and in religion is not a little rock balancing forever in eternity in the same spot. Permanence is not a thing staying the same forever. Well, there's only one thing that can stay the same forever, and that is heaven. Because there is nothing that heaven is not. And heaven can never be less than itself. So there, heaven cannot change. But all other things do change. And they change in the process of becoming like or unlike heaven. Things that grow become more like heaven by changing. Things that regress become less like heaven by changing. But everything changes. Heaven is eternal, but it is also eternal motion, eternal life, eternal unfoldment, eternal becoming. The greatest permanence, therefore, is the individual being able to enter the systematic condition of forever becoming. This is his greatest possibility of permanence. And this possibility is bound to heaven and not to the earth. Out of the idea, then, of heaven, we now have heaven as origin and heaven as ultimate, and earth as a little place between these two things. Earth is like maturity, suspended between childhood and old age. Earth is like that moment of success, suspended between the struggle to gain and the inevitable circumstance of loss. Earth is the momentary gratification, inevitably leading to pain, to sorrow, to loss, dissatisfaction, and the final necessity to relinquish all that has been achieved. The Chinese, consequently, believed that man must choose. He must choose by his own nature between heaven and earth. He must choose to follow heaven. And in order to follow heaven, he cannot directly imitate heaven. The Emperor of China might be the greatest man on earth, according to Chinese thinking at least, and he might have the most splendid symbols of temporal authority conceivable. But in the great ceremony of the Fortunate New Year, the Emperor, when he approached his own father, imperial heaven, had to cast off all his raiment of glory and come as a humble being in a plain white robe. In the same way, when the high priest of Israel entered into the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle or the temple, he could not